On a freezing winter night in the wild heart of Yellowstone, a young Shoshone girl saved a dying wolf with nothing but her courage. She never imagined that years later that same wolf, now leading a pack 100 strong, would return to save her village from certain destruction. This is the untold legend of the white wolf. The first storm of December had come howling down from the high peaks, carrying with it a cold so sharp it seemed to cut the air in two. Yellowstone lay under siege. The land was frozen in a kind of terrible beauty, the rivers slowed to sluggish black veins beneath sheets of ice, the geysers breathing ghostly steam into a sky the color of forged steel. Every living thing had either burrowed deep into the earth or stood hunched against the wind, waiting for the wrath of winter to pass. But there are moments in the Wild West when winter is not the greatest danger one can meet. Nayeli knew this as she pressed forward through snow that came to her knees, the hiss of her snowshoes nearly lost under the keening wind. The girl had been raised by a people who read the seasons like a hunter reads tracks, who saw omens in the drift of clouds and the flight of ravens. Her pack was heavy with willow bark sage and roots pulled from beneath ice-locked soil medicine that could mean the difference between life and death for her Shoshone village in the long months ahead. She was thinking of home, of the firelight against the lodge walls, when a sound cut across the storm. It was not the cry of coyote or the bark of fox. It was a sound she had never heard so close, a low, guttural growl that broke halfway into something that might have been a whimper. She stopped, the wind tugging at the fringes of her hood. There it was again, threaded through the howl of the storm, pain and rage in equal measure. She followed the sound into a stand of wind-bent pines, her boots crunching over ice-crusted snow. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper here, the air thicker. And then she saw it, a shape sprawled against the whiteness, a stark spill of silver fur streaked with red. Her breath caught. It was a wolf larger than any she had imagined possible, its flank rising and falling in ragged heaves. Steam rose from its body where blood met snow. An arrow jutted from its shoulder, the shaft splintered the fletching, torn and soaked dark. Whoever had fired it had meant to kill. The wolf's head lifted as she drew closer, and their eyes met eyes the color of winter steel, fierce enough to root her to the spot. Its lips peeled back from white fangs, a warning growl rolling from deep in its chest. It was the sound of a wild thing, cornered a sound that promised violence if she came a step nearer. But Nayeli did not step back. Something in those eyes, beneath the fury, beneath the pain, spoke to her of a fight that was not yet lost. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her bow into the snow. She spoke then in her own tongue, the words soft, but carrying over the wind words her grandmother had used to soothe frightened horses and restless children. The wolf's ears flicked once, but the growl did not fade. She knew the risk in what she was about to do. A wounded predator was as dangerous as any man with a gun. But she also knew what leaving it here meant. The cold alone would finish the work the arrow had started. With hands that trembled only from the cold, she unfastened the heavy deer-hide cloak from her shoulders and eased it over the wolf's shivering body. It tensed under her touch, the muscles like coiled cable beneath the fur, but it did not lunge. The nearest shelter was a cave she had found seasons ago while tracking elk along the ridge, a place where the wind was muted and the stone held the memory of warmth. She gripped the wolf under its forelegs, surprised at the sheer weight of it, and began to drag. The journey was slow, the snow resisting her every step, the wind lashing at her face until her eyes burned. Twice the wolf snarled its head, twisting toward her hands, but each time it stilled, as though some invisible thread held it back from striking. By the time she reached the cave, her breath was coming in ragged bursts, her arms trembling from the effort. She laid the wolf on a bed of pine boughs and went to work building a fire. sparks caught in the dry tinder flames, licking upward until the shadows retreated. The wolf watched her every muscle taut its gaze, unblinking. When the water had boiled, she crushed willow bark into it, letting the bitter steam curl into the air. She spoke to it again, not expecting understanding, only offering her voice as something steady in a world of hurt. With the steam curling around her, she knelt beside the wolf and studied the wound. The arrow had broken near the shaft, leaving the head buried deep. The smell of blood was heavy now, mingled with the acrid tang of pine sap from the poultice she had ready. The first touch of her hand to its fur brought another growl, but she held her ground. "If I leave it," she murmured more to herself than to it, "you die." And with that she gripped the shaft and pulled in one swift, merciless motion. The wolf's body jerked a snarl tearing from its throat, but it did not rise. Blood welled dark and hot, and she pressed the poultice in place, binding it with strips of leather until the bleeding slowed. That night, the wind screamed outside the cave, the snow hissing against the stone. Nayeli sat with her back to the fire, her knees drawn up the wolf lying a few feet away, its sides rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Its eyes were half closed, but she knew it was not asleep. She had no illusions. Trust was not something you pulled from an animal like this with a single act. It would come, if at all, in small steps. Still, as the hours passed and the fire burned low, something shifted. The wolf's breathing evened out the lines of tension in its body, easing. Near dawn, when the wind had dropped to a tired whisper, it lifted, its head, looked at her for a long moment, and then, as if making a choice, lowered it onto its paws and closed its eyes. In that instant, something passed between them. Not surrender, not yet friendship, but an acknowledgement. And though Nayeli could not know it, then the choice she made in that storm would set in motion a chain of events that would carry her far beyond the safety of her village into a story that would be told around fires long after both girl and wolf were gone. A story born in the teeth of winter in the heart of Yellowstone, under a sky the color of steel. The wolf was gone. One moment it had been there in the half-light of dawn, its breath curling in pale clouds. The next, the cave was empty, the bedding of pine boughs cold to the touch. Nayeli stood at the entrance for a long time, the wind tugging strands of hair loose from her braid, her eyes scanning the white emptiness below the ridge. There were no tracks, fresh snow had buried them, erasing its trail as cleanly as if it had never been there at all. A knot of pride and loss settled in her chest. The wolf had healed. That had been her goal from the start, but its absence left a hollow space she couldn't quite name. The days that followed were filled with the ordinary demands of winter's end. The thaw came slowly to Yellowstone, and with it the call for trade. Her stores of dried herbs were low, and she needed to bring hides to barter for tools and salt. The nearest post lay near the base of Devil's Tower, where the high plains stretched out in frozen waves, and the great stone monolith rose straight from the earth like the spine of an ancient beast. She set out at first light, the air sharp with frost, her pack heavy on her shoulders. The land between was both open and deceptive. One could see for miles, but in the dips and folds of the prairie, trouble could hide until it was too close to outrun. The journey was long enough for her thoughts to drift. She wondered if the silver wolf still roamed somewhere in the shadows of the forest, or if it had vanished deeper into the mountains beyond the places she would ever go. It was near midday when she heard the distant rhythm of hooves. She paused on a rise, scanning the land below. A column of riders was moving along the narrow draw, a handful of men, their coats, ragged rifles slung low. In their midst rode another man, his hands bound in front of him, his head bowed beneath the brim of a weather-beaten hat. His coat was stained dark along the ribs, and even from a distance she could see the slump of his shoulders, the unnatural way he swayed in the saddle. The men surrounding him moved with the casual confidence of hunters who knew their prey had no way out. Their voices carried up to her on the wind, crude and mocking. She crouched low, her eyes narrowing as she studied the ground. The draw funneled them toward a slope of loose shale. If she moved quickly, she could get above them before they passed. She left her pack in the snow and climbed the cold, biting her hands through her gloves. At the top, she slid the bow from her shoulder and knocked an arrow, drawing until the string trembled against her cheek. She chose the lead rider take him down, and the rest would be thrown into confusion. She loosed the arrow. It flew true, striking the man cleanly. He toppled sideways into the snow, his horse shying and crashing into the rider beside it. Shouts rose the column, breaking apart. Nayeli didn't wait to see more. She was already sliding down the far side of the slope, landing in the churned snow beside the bound man's horse. Up close, she saw the grit in his eyes beneath the shadow of his hat, the set of his jaw even in pain. His wrists were raw from the rope. Without a word, she drew her knife and sliced through the bindings. "Move," she said sharply. He hesitated only long enough to glance at her, the surprise flickering across his face before he swung down from the saddle. His boots hit the snow hard. His breath caught as he clutched at his side. She slung his arm over her shoulder, taking as much of his weight as she could. Behind them, the shouts grew louder. Boots hit the ground. The crunch of snow told her they were coming fast. She pulled him toward the narrow strip of pines at the edge of the draw, the branches swallowing them in shadow. They pushed through until the sounds behind them began to fade. She slowed only when they reached a tangle of fallen logs where the snow lay undisturbed. The man leaned heavily against one, his breath ragged. "You're hurt," she said, though it was obvious. "I've been worse," he replied, though the words were tight with pain. "Name's Ethan." She gave him a curt nod. "You'll be worse still if we stay here. They'll be looking." "Those men." He stopped, his gaze hardening. "They won't stop until they've finished it." Nayeli didn't ask what it was. Whatever his story, she had seen enough to know it carried danger. And now, by pulling him from their hands, she had placed herself in that same path. They moved again, her guiding him through low gullies where their tracks would be hidden from above. His steps faltered more than once, but he didn't complain. She began to see in him something familiar, a will to keep moving, even when every step came at a cost. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, they had crossed into the rolling foothills that marked the edge of her people's land. Smoke from the village rose in the distance, a thin line against the cold sky. She felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. As they neared the first line of lodges, the children stopped their games to watch the elders lifting their heads from their work. Ethan's presence drew quiet stares. Strangers were not common here in winter. Nayeli led him to her family's lodge, where her grandmother took one look at his wounds and set about heating water and mixing herbs. Ethan sank down near the fire, his eyes scanning the room as if measuring it for threats. She watched him for a moment before turning away to hang her cloak. Whatever his history, he was here now under her roof, and though she did not yet know why fate had placed him in her path, a part of her could not shake the feeling that, like the wolf, he had been delivered to her for a reason that would not be clear until much later. That night, long after the lodge had gone quiet, she stepped outside. The snow reflected the moonlight so brightly it seemed the world was made of silver. Somewhere on the ridge, a single howl broke the stillness. She turned toward the sound, her breath catching. It was far away, perhaps miles, but it carried the same fierce edge she remembered. She stood there a long time listening before she went back inside. Ethan slept deeply by the fire, his face drawn but calm. She lay down across the room, the echo of the howl still in her ears. She didn't know if it was a promise or a warning, only that something had shifted and the path ahead was no longer hers alone. The snows of Jackson Hole melted slowly, as though the land itself was reluctant to let go of winter. From the lodge where Ethan lay recovering, Nayeli could see the peaks of the Tetons standing like silent guardians, their summits still capped in white. The river that wound through the valley had begun to run faster, its waters swelling with melt, and the willows along its banks carried the first pale green of the season. Life in the village moved with the deliberate rhythm of survival, steady, purposeful, and bound to the land. Ethan spent his first days there in the quiet haze of recovery. The herbs Nayeli prepared eased his pain and drew the fever from his body, but it was the firelight, the sound of the wind in the willows, and the unspoken safety of the lodge that softened the tension in his shoulders. He rarely spoke of himself in those early days, answering questions with a nod or a short phrase. But Nayeli noticed the way his eyes followed everything, the way he studied the layout of the village, the paths in and out, the positions where one could take cover. It was the habit of a man who had learned to survive by always knowing his surroundings. Nayeli worked as she always did, tanning hides, grinding roots, mending garments. When her tasks allowed, she would sit near the fire and tell stories from her childhood. She did not know if he listened, for his gaze was often fixed on the flames, but sometimes she would catch the faintest hint of a smile at the edges of his mouth. One afternoon, when she came back from the river with a bundle of freshly cut willow branches, she found him struggling to repair a worn saddle strap. His stitches were uneven, the leather pulling awkwardly under his hands. Without a word, she knelt beside him and showed him the Shoshone way of binding leather tight, even strong enough to last through rain and sun. He watched her hands intently, then tried again, his movements becoming surer. A few days later, he returned the favor. She had been trying to coil a length of rope for storage, but it twisted stubbornly. He took it from her hands with a dry chuckle and showed her how to loop it into a lasso. The rope hissed through the air as he swung it in a perfect arc before letting it fall neatly over a fence post. She tried, and the first attempt landed in the dirt, but by the third try she caught the post. His low laugh warmed her in a way the fire never could. Trust came slowly, but it came. In the evenings when the work was done, Ethan would sit with her outside the lodge watching the mountains fade into shadow. Sometimes they spoke of small things, the way the light shifted on the peaks, the tracks of elk seen near the river. Other times, the silence between them was its own kind of conversation. It was during one of these evenings, with the sky painted in streaks of gold and crimson, that Ethan finally told her the truth of why he had been hunted. He spoke of Laramie, of the gang that had made the town theirs through fear, and of the night he had seen them kill a man he called friend. He had not meant to be a witness, but once they saw him there had been no going back. They had pursued him across plains and mountains, and each time he thought he'd lost them they found his trail again. Nayeli listened without interruption. When he finished, she said only, "They will come here too if they believe you are still alive." It was not a question. He met her gaze and nodded. "I know." Her people had faced danger before, bands of raiders, traders who came to take more than they gave, but she could not ignore the weight in his words. This was not the kind of threat that faded with the change of season. Still, she did not regret bringing him here. Something in her understood that his fate was now tied to hers in ways neither of them could yet see. One morning, while checking her traps along the ridge, she found tracks in the snow. They were large, the pads deep and clear, each one pressing into the crust with the sure weight of an apex predator. She crouched and traced the print with her fingertips. The size, the shape, it was no ordinary wolf. Her breath caught as a memory surged, silver fur streaked with red eyes like winter steel. The tracks led along the ridge, skirting the village before disappearing into the pines. She felt no fear, only a strange comfort, as though some watchful presence had passed through to remind her it still existed. The days lengthened and Ethan's strength returned. He began to help with chores, carrying water, chopping wood, repairing fences damaged by winter storms. The children of the village followed him with open curiosity, fascinated by his wide-brimmed hat and the way he could spin a rope. In return, he learned from Nayeli's people how to read the wind for changes in weather, how to follow a deer's trail by the tilt of a broken branch, how to walk so softly on snow you left barely a mark. One evening, a storyteller came to the village, a man with hair the color of ash who traveled between winter camps to keep the old tales alive. The people gathered around the fire in the central clearing, the air thick with the scent of burning sage. Nayeli sat beside Ethan as the man spoke of spirits that walked in the form of animals of bonds between humans and the wild that could not be broken by time or distance. The words stirred something deep in her. She glanced at Ethan and found his gaze fixed on the fire, his expression unreadable, but she knew he was listening. That night, as the village slept, Nayeli lay awake in the quiet. She thought of the wolf and its silent departure of Ethan's weary eyes when he first stumbled into her arms, and of the tracks on the ridge. In her heart, these things felt connected, though she could not yet see the shape of the connection. The mountains loomed dark against the starlit sky, their shadows long and patient. Somewhere out there she felt the story was still unfolding, and the time was coming when both she and Ethan would have to step fully into it. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest sound from far beyond the village, the long, low call of a wolf. She closed her eyes and let it echo through her, not as a warning, but as a promise. The night was calm enough to hear the river running beyond the willows, its steady murmur like a voice speaking in the dark. The air was cool and clear, the sky heavy with stars that shimmered above the shadowed Tetons. In the village, fires had burned low, and most had drifted into the quiet of sleep. Nayeli was still awake, sitting outside her lodge with Ethan beside her. They spoke little, letting the stillness wrap around them. But stillness in the Wild West was a fragile thing, and this night it would not last. The first sound was faint, a distant drumming of hooves on hard ground. At first it seemed far enough to ignore, but Ethan's posture stiffened. His head tilted slightly, listening in the way of a man who had learned to trust the warnings of sound long before danger was visible. He turned to her eyes, narrowing. "They're coming," he said. There was no need to ask who. She felt it too, a change in the air, the way the horses moved with a purpose that did not belong to travelers passing through. The thundering grew louder. Then the sharp crack of a rifle split the night. Shouts followed, harsh and unrelenting, rising above the pounding of hooves. The first torches appeared at the edge of the village, their flames casting wild, jerking shadows over the lodges. Dogs barked furiously before their voices were drowned out by the chaos of the raid. Ethan was already on his feet, pulling her toward the lodge to arm themselves. Nayeli's fingers found the familiar curve of her bow, her quiver slung over her shoulder in one practiced motion. Outside, warriors were rushing to meet the attackers, but the gang had numbers on their side. Men poured into the clearing, their horses snorting and rearing torches thrown toward the thatched roofs. Dry winter reeds caught fire almost instantly. She loosed her first arrow, watching it find its mark in a rider's shoulder. Ethan took cover behind a low wall, his rifle cracking in precise, measured shots. Villagers scrambled to protect the elders and children, leading them toward the shadowed safety of the trees. The night was alive with the roar of fire and the gunmetal stench of spent powder. But no matter how hard they fought, it was clear they were being driven back. The gang was pressing in their shouts, mocking, confident. A torch landed near the lodge where Ethan had slept these past weeks, flames licking upward, as if eager to erase it from the earth. Nayeli's breath came fast. She felt the weight of the moment, the truth that if something did not change soon, their home would be nothing but ash by morning. Then, cutting through the noise, came a sound that made every head turn. A howl, long, deep, and carrying the strength of 100 winters. It rolled over the village like thunder, silencing the shouts for a heartbeat. The gang's horses shifted uneasily, ears flicking back. Another howl answered the first, then another, until the air trembled with the chorus. From the darkness beyond the river, shadows began to move low to the ground, swift, unstoppable. Wolves, dozens of them. No more than dozens, an entire pack, their eyes glinting gold in the firelight, their bodies flowing over the snow with the precision of a single living force. At their head ran a massive silver wolf, its fur catching the light like molten metal, its presence commanding the space between earth and sky. Nayeli's heart leapt. Even in the chaos, she knew those eyes, that scar on the shoulder where an arrow had once pierced. The silver wolf moved with a fury that was almost surgical, striking with power, but never lingering long enough to be struck in return. The gang broke under the assault. Horses screamed, some rearing and throwing their riders. Men, who had swaggered into the village only moments before now, shouted in panic, their shots going wild as they tried to fend off the predators. Wolves darted in and out, snapping at legs and arms, driving the attackers into disarray. Ethan didn't waste the moment. He fired at the men still standing their ground, each shot finding its mark. Nayeli's arrows flew swift and sure, her aim honed to the space between one breath and the next. Around them, the villagers rallied, pushing forward alongside the wolves, as if the two forces had always been meant to fight together. The battle turned fast. Those who could flee did, vanishing into the trees or spurring their horses toward the open plains. The rest were driven down the slope toward the river, where they stumbled in the half-frozen shallows before scattering into the darkness. And then it was over. The fire still burned, crackling in the wind, but the voices of the gang had faded to nothing. The wolves stood in the open, now their breaths steaming in the cold air. The silver wolf stepped forward, its gaze locked on Nayeli. The world seemed to narrow until it was only the two of them, the rest of the village falling away. It approached, slow but certain, until its great head was level with her hand. She reached out her fingers, brushing the thick fur along its muzzle. For a moment, the two stood like that, no words between them, only the recognition of a bond forged in another storm, in another place. The wolf's eyes held hers, and in them she saw something she could not name, gratitude perhaps, or a promise that went deeper than speech. Then it turned, giving a short, low sound to the pack. They moved as one, fading back into the darkness, their tracks already beginning to vanish under the drifting snow. Nayeli stood there for a long while, the fire's heat on her face, the cold wind at her back. Around her, the villagers began to gather, some weeping, others speaking in hushed voices about what they had witnessed. Ethan came to stand beside her, his rifle resting loosely in his hand. "That was your wolf, wasn't it?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer at once, still watching the place where the silver shape had disappeared. Finally she nodded. "Yes, and it will come again if we need it." The night smelled of smoke and wild sage, the air still charged with the energy of the fight. But beneath it all was something else, a sense that they had been touched by something rare, something that belonged to the land as much as to the people who lived on it. Whatever came next, the memory of this night would remain, and so would the bond between a girl, a man, and a silver wolf that had returned when all hope seemed lost. Spring in. Jackson Hole came like a slow exhale, as though the valley itself had been holding its breath through the long winter and the fire of that night. Snow melted from the rooftops in rivulets, soaking the dark earth beneath. The river swelled with icy runoff, singing a faster song now, and the willows along its banks put out their first green shoots. Where there had been ash and ruin, the people of the village began to rebuild. It was not done quickly. Every beam had to be cut and carried, every stone placed by hand. Yet there was a quiet determination in each movement, a shared understanding that this was more than work, it was reclamation. The land still held them. They still belonged here. Nayeli worked alongside her neighbors, mending what could be saved and helping to raise what had been lost. Ethan stayed as well, moving through the village with an ease that had not been there when he first arrived. He split logs, repaired fences, and lent his hands to the construction of lodges, his voice occasionally carrying in quiet jokes that brought short bursts of laughter from those working nearby. His presence was no longer that of a stranger passing through, but of someone who had chosen to stay and shoulder part of the weight. At the edge of the village, a group of carvers worked day after day on a tall cedar trunk, shaping it into the likeness of a wolf's head. Its eyes would look toward the mountains, a silent sentinel. When it was finished, the totem was set upright in the earth, its base surrounded by a ring of smooth river stones. Offerings were placed there, small pouches of herbs, strips of meat, and carved figures, gifts of respect for the wild guardians who had saved them. Each full moon, the people vowed the totem would receive new offerings, a reminder to never forget the night the wolves came. Time moved forward, but something in the air between Nayeli and Ethan deepened with each passing day. There was no rush, no declaration shouted above the noise of work. Instead, it was in the way their eyes found each other across the clearing, in the small silences that felt full rather than empty. One evening, as the sun sank behind the Tetons and the valley was bathed in amber light, Ethan spoke what had been building between them. His words were simple. "I've been running for a long time, but I think I've found where I want to stop." The spring thaw brought with it the decision to wed. Word spread quickly through the village, and preparations began in earnest. The women worked on Nayeli's gown, soft buckskin, embroidered with patterns in turquoise and white beads, the designs telling the story of her family's line. The men shaped a wedding staff from polished willow to be placed in the ground during the ceremony as a symbol of a union rooted in the land. Ethan took part as well, crafting gifts for the children from cedar and sinew, his hands steady as he carved. The morning of the wedding dawned clear, the peaks of the Tetons gleaming against a sky so blue it felt endless. The air was crisp but not cold, carrying the scent of sage and new grass. In the central clearing, the fire had been built high, its smoke curling in steady columns toward the open sky. The people gathered in a wide circle, their voices low with anticipation. Nayeli stepped into the clearing with her hair braided and threaded with eagle feathers, her gown catching the light. Ethan stood waiting, wearing a clean white shirt and a dark vest, his hat in his hands. The ceremony began with the beating of a single drum, slow and steady, like the rhythm of a heart. An elder spoke in the old tongue, blessing the union and calling upon the spirits of the land to witness it. Nayeli and Ethan faced one another as a long strip of dyed leather was wound around their joined hands, binding them together. They each drank from a carved wooden cup, sharing water drawn from the river that had always fed the valley. The elder spoke again, and the leather strip was tied in a knot, no longer just two people but a single path forward. It was then that a movement caught Nayeli's eye. From the shadow of the tree line, figures emerged, silent, graceful, unmistakable. Wolves. A dozen at first, then more, until nearly the entire pack stood at the forest's edge. At their head was the silver wolf, its coat bright against the green of the trees, its eyes fixed on her. The crowd noticed and fell silent, the air charged with awe. The wolf stood still for a moment, then lifted its head and let out a long, rolling howl. The sound was answered instantly by the pack, a chorus that filled the valley and seemed to echo against the mountains themselves. Ethan's hand tightened around hers. She felt her throat tighten, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that this was no accident. The silver wolf's presence was a blessing, a recognition of the bond that had begun in a storm and endured through fire. The howl faded, and the pack turned back toward the forest, disappearing into the shadows as silently as they had come. The rest of the day was filled with celebration. There was food-roasted venison, cornbread berries preserved through the winter, and music that carried long into the night. Laughter mingled with the crackle of the fire, and the dancing in the clearing went on until the stars wheeled overhead. Ethan and Nayeli joined in their movements, sometimes clumsy, but their smiles unguarded the weight of the past, replaced by something lighter. Later, when most of the village had drifted to sleep and the fire burned low, Nayeli and Ethan walked to the ridge above the valley. From there, they could see the lodges below, glowing faintly like embers, and beyond them, the dark sweep of the forest. The air was cool, the scent of pine and earth rising with the wind. Ethan put his arm around her, and for a while they said nothing at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. "This is home," she said. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And it always will be." Far off, carried by the wind, came a single howl. It was not followed by others, just one voice in the night, strong and clear. Nayeli closed her eyes and listened, knowing that wherever the path ahead took them, they would not walk it alone. The legend of the White Wolf was no longer just a story to be told. It was a living promise bound now to their lives, as enduring as the mountains, and as certain as the return of spring. When the dust and snow of that fateful season finally settled, the story of Nayeli Ethan and the Great Silver Wolf was no longer just an episode in the life of a remote mountain village. It had become a legend. Told by firelight and passed from voice to voice, it was remembered not for its battles alone, but for the way it intertwined courage, trust, and the unbreakable connection between people and the wild world that surrounds them. Nayeli's journey began on an ordinary winter's day in Yellowstone, one of those days when the cold seems to press the land flat, and the only sounds are the hiss of wind and the crunch of snow underfoot. In the heart of that frozen quiet, she found the wolf wounded, cornered, and close to death. Her choice to act was not born from calculation or the expectation of reward. It was instinct shaped by a life lived in rhythm with the land. She gave her cloak her strength and her skill to save a creature that many in her position would have feared or avoided. In that act of compassion, she forged a bond that would outlast seasons. The wolf left, as wild creatures must, and with its absence came a different test. In the shadow of Devil's Tower, Nayeli crossed paths with Ethan, a man hunted by violence, carrying the weight of betrayal and loss. Saving him was a risk, one that placed her in the sights of dangerous men, but again she acted without hesitation. Her rescue brought Ethan into the shelter of her village, where healing happened in more ways than one. He came to know her world, the beadwork, the stories, the quiet moments by the fire, and she learned to see beyond the guarded lines of his face into the grit and loyalty beneath. Trust grew between them, not as a sudden flame, but as an ember carefully tended. They shared skills and silences, stories and laughter. It was a fragile peace, shadowed by the knowledge that Ethan's past was still on their trail. That shadow broke open one night when the gang arrived, torches and rifles turning the village into a battleground. The fight might have ended in ruin, if not for a sound carried on the wind, the voice of the wolf. What came next defied all expectation. 100 wolves moving like a single force, sweeping through the attackers until the threat was scattered to the edges of the dark. The Silver Wolf stood before Nayeli once more, no longer the wounded creature she had dragged through the snow, but a leader in its prime. The brief touch of its muzzle to her hand was more than recognition. It was the closing of a circle begun months before, in a winter storm. Then it was gone again, vanishing into the forest, but its mark on the village and on their lives was permanent. Spring brought rebuilding. The village rose from the ashes, a new cedar totem standing at its edge to honor the wolves who had defended them. In that time of renewal, Nayeli and Ethan's bond deepened into a choice to build a life together. Their wedding beneath the Tetons was more than a celebration of love. It was a vow rooted in the land and witnessed by its wild inhabitants. When the silver wolf appeared at the forest's edge with its pack raising a howl that was answered by a chorus, it was as if the mountains themselves had spoken a blessing over them. From that day on, the legend of the white wolf was more than a tale. It was a reminder of the ties that can be formed when fear is set aside in favor of respect and compassion. It was proof that one act of kindness can ripple outward in ways impossible to predict, sometimes returning with a force that can change the outcome of an entire people's fate. The lesson at the heart of their story is simple, but it carries weight. What we choose to protect defines us more than what we choose to gain. Nayeli could have walked past the wounded wolf, spared herself the danger and effort. Ethan could have left the village once his wounds had healed, returning to the wandering life that kept him from forming ties. Both could have acted only in their own interest. But instead, they stood for something beyond themselves, heritage, community, and each other. And when the time came, that choice was repaid in kind. Applied to the present day, this truth holds as firmly as it did in the snows of Yellowstone. We may not face outlaw gangs or fight alongside wolves, but each of us has moments when we must decide whether to protect something precious, our values, our family, our integrity, our cultural roots, or even the fragile beauty of the natural world. In a world where it's easier to look away, to say someone else will handle it, the courage to step forward is rare. Yet it is exactly in those moments that we create the bonds and legacies that last. This story also speaks to the strength found in unexpected alliances. Nayeli Ethan and the Silver Wolf came from worlds that did not naturally intersect. Yet, together, they formed a force strong enough to repel what neither could face alone. In our own lives, this might mean accepting help from those we never imagined working with, or offering our own strength to someone whose path has suddenly crossed ours. Trust, when honored, has the power to turn strangers into allies, and allies into family. Perhaps most importantly, their journey is a reminder that it is never too late to find where you belong. Ethan had wandered for years, convinced that home was something lost to him forever. Yet home was waiting hidden in the curve of a valley, in the steady work of rebuilding, in the gaze of someone who had stood beside him in both quiet and chaos. For any of us who feel adrift that truth offers hope, there is a place and a purpose and a connection meant for each of us, though we may have to walk through fire and snow to reach it. The legend of the white wolf endures not because it is filled with danger and drama, though it has both, but because it touches something deeper. The belief that acts of courage, no matter how small, can echo far beyond the moment they are made. That kindness given without promise of return is never truly lost. And that somewhere just beyond the edge of the firelight there are forces watching over us, ready to answer when the need is great. If the story of Nayeli Ethan and the Silver Wolf has stirred something in you, if you felt the wind off the Tetons, the pull of the fire's warmth against a winter's night, or the wild thrill of hearing a howl answered across the distance, then carry it with you. Let it be a reminder to act when the moment comes, to protect what matters, to seek connection, even when trust feels dangerous. Those choices may shape more than your own fate. They may one day become the story someone else tells when they speak of courage. And if you want to keep walking these dusty trails with us to hear more of the untamed, unvarnished tales of the Wild West, the kind that carry both grit and grace, then don't let this be the end. Subscribe to the channel, join this circle by the fire, and help us keep these stories alive. Your support gives us the strength to dig deeper, ride farther, and bring you the next chapter in the long, wild history of the frontier. There's another legend waiting just beyond the horizon, and we'd be honored to share it with you.